today's webinar, 5 practical ways to enhance your BPM deployment. So everyone's looking forward to your new BPM initiative. Your CEO is excited about reducing costs and getting rid of inefficiency. And of course, frontline staff can't wait for improved processes that make their lives easier. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, unfortunately, the answer is quite a few things. But not to worry, because our presenters today, Forrest Breyfogle and Rick Haynes, are here to share with us 5 practical steps to make sure that your BPM implementation stays on track. Forrest is CEO and founder of Smarter Solutions, a consulting and training company that offers process improvement and re-engineering solutions. Forrest has over 2 decades of experience in process improvement and has authored numerous books on statistics and Lean Six Sigma, including statistical methods for testing, development, and manufacturing, implementing Six Sigma, smarter solutions using statistical methods, and managing Six Sigma, and many, many more. Rick is Director of Client Services and Statistician, and a statistician with Smarter Solutions. Like Forrest, he has more than 20 years experience in project management, training, applied statistics, engineering, and customer support. He holds multiple certifications at all levels of Lean Six Sigma, from champion master black belt right down to yellow belt. Now, just before I pass it over to Forrest, 2 very quick housekeeping points. First, there will be time for a very brief Q&A period towards the end of the presentation. However, Rick and Forrest will be happy to take questions throughout the presentation. So please do feel free to submit questions at any time using the text box that you should see in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Secondly, if you would like a copy of the slides of today's presentation, all you'll need to do is send an email to Rick or Forrest. You've got their email up on the screen in front of you, and they'll be more than happy to share it with you. So with the housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to pass it over to Forrest.
Okay, well, this is Forrest here, and I think Rick and I have kind of talked about how we're going to do this webinar together here. So I think Rick's going to start off with some of the introductory slides. So both of us are really looking forward to this session and seeing how it goes. Rick?
Thank you, everybody, for attendance. Again, as Diane said, you can get a copy of the slides by emailing us. We will also have an email address at the end of the slide if you didn't catch this one. First, a set of technologies that support managing the processes. Now, if you search the internet, I don't know if you'd find that one. You would find the big software vendors that are pushing hard at the top of the list. We're going to try to give you some help through this webinar of what you can do with any software system to improve your BPM employment, deployment, or wherever you happen to be. Again, we believe it's the management of your process that's the real benefit of BPM. Yes, if you automate, you can standardize some and reduce labor, but really, the undersell, or what we miss a lot, is building a management system around those automated processes so they really provide what you need. We're going to cover 5, we consider, simple concepts that you can add to your system to actually improve the effectiveness of your business process management system. Now, before we start, they don't have to be done before. They can be done in the middle or even after your deployment started to enhance the benefits of your program. Now, don't worry. Again, no software needed for this. These will benefit new and existing efforts. Forrest is going to start this off and talk about the value chain.
Okay. Rick, I'm still seeing the original slide here. I don't know if everybody...
Oh, wow. I have not turned on my slides.
Yeah, there you go. Okay, so I'm going to be going in and talking about the value chain, and this is the first of the 5 steps that we're going to be talking about here. And I think this is a very important aspect of the BPM, is that we need to really put something together that describes what we do and how we measure what we do. And one of the things that that actually communicate that can be used to communicate throughout the organization is the value chain. Now, where did the value chain start? Well, that was Michael Porter started it on in his book. Get a picture of what's happening in BPM. And this is one way of really doing it. And so we want to manage our processes, because a lot of times what organizations do, they manage to the output instead of understanding that the inputs really go in and get you to the outputs. And we want to create an overall system that puts it all together, and that's what we can do with this overall BPM effort here, utilizing the value chain. Okay? Now, the way we're putting together the value chain is a little bit different than Michael Porter. And this is our version. We call it the Integrated Enterprise Excellence Value Chain, or IEE Value Chain. And if you notice at the top, we have connection of those little boxes, and that describes the primary functions or what's happening within the organization. And what I'm showing here is an example of one that you might have for a hospital. So you start with voice of the customer, then you get to sales and marketing, deliver clinical service, invoice and collect, and report financials. And I think it's really important to include financials within this, because that's what it's really all about. Even if you're a nonprofit, you have to go in and bring revenue in to keep the lights on. Now, you're also going to have, as part of the value chain, you're going to have other support groups. You've got the IT and so on, and that's part of the value chain also. And then the box at the end, or the lower left-hand corner, enterprise process management, that's kind of putting it all together. Somebody, a function that actually pulls it all together. Okay? So now if we look at what it takes to actually put together the overall value chain, is we first off want to start with the functional processes. What do we do, our procedures and things like that? You know, a lot of times people have procedures, but they tend to be all over the place. And what we like to do is put them all together basically in the value chain so people can readily find it. We like to have also the value chain to be clickable so people can get to that. But also what we're adding to this is we're putting performance metrics in there. So I think that's a really important aspect of this, because a lot of times what happens in organizations, we have people in the north wing of the building working on scorecards, and then the people in the south wing of the building work on process improvement. They don't talk to each other. And what we're trying to do together with this value chain is pulling it basically all together. Now, what we're going to be talking about a little bit is the 30,000-foot level reporting methodologies for these scorecards. So it's not just a matter of having a table of numbers or pie charts or stacked bar charts and things like that, but we're looking at having a predictive way of actually looking at the scorecard. So again, the value chain kind of puts together processes and the performance metrics.
All right, this is Rick. Please, as Diana said, if you have any questions, we'd like to discuss them as soon as we can. Please use the chat function in your GoToMeeting window. But what I want to add to what Forrest said, that was important, but I think this piece is key to having a strong BPM system. It's like the foundation that everything's built on, and I think too many of the people we deal with skipped over this, and they end up with missing pieces that they have to catch up with later. So this may seem simple, but it really is a key foundation of a business process management implementation. All right?
Yes, and I think a lot of times if you look at some of the literature on BPM, it's not included as much as I think it should be.
I agree, Forrest.
Yes. And so the next thing we have in our 5-step process is to really identify the key performance metrics. So let's look at how you do this. Well, there could be several different ways on how to do this, because what we really want to look at, what is going to drive success for each one of these functions. And that's what's really important. We want to also have an owner of that too, but what really functionally, or what really measurements are a good indicator of how good a job we did at those functions. We'll change the slide.
Oh, I'm late changing the slide. Thanks.
Okay. Obviously, we're not in the same place. I'm over in Vegas and Rick's in Austin here. So, but if we go in and click on the value chain, and we again try to make this all clickable, is if we look at the deliver and service products, we notice that we have at the top swim lane, we've indicated our performance measures. So these are the measurements that we think are important relative to that per function. And also below that, we have the actual procedures that are important for that particular function that in the end affect that overall metric that we're looking at in the top swim lane. And again, what we want to report those metrics out in the 30,000-foot level, high-level view of how that particular process is performing.
As you can see from that, this is Rick again, this hierarchy of what you do in the value chain down to your actual processes, this linkage really builds another connection to your BPM process if you get to automation. You'll see your metrics, you'll see where they connect, but you'll also create an alignment up to understand how they're really driving business success. That's why, although it seems simple, this is a key step.
Yes. So again, if we look at each of the functions and people start saying, well, how am I going to actually measure how well this performance or this function is performing, then the thing is we might have a different opinions on what makes a good measurement for that particular function. But the way we like to look at it or ask questions is, what are good measurements relative to quality, cost, and time? Now, there can be other particular outputs or that you might have in the process that are maybe subordinate to that. And we might be able to look at those as inter-process performance measures. But we really would like to start kind of at a high level and then start going out and cascade down to lower levels throughout the organization. Okay, now, if there's other methods, as I mentioned, that you can use to go in and capture what are good metrics for particular functions, and we have some of those listed there. Look at customer requirements, you could talk to the subject matter experts, do brainstorming and benchmarking. But I would still like to always come back to start thinking about what's a good measure from quality, cost, and time. And that's a good foundation that I like to work from. And again, we like to end up reporting these as 30,000-foot level metrics and not just, again, table of numbers and variances to goals and so on. Now, it's important to really understand that the output, the Y of the process, is a function of the inputs to the process and the process itself. And that can be expressed as Y as a function of X. So basically, if you don't like the Y, you might have to do something different for the X's. Or what we also like to do as part of BPM is we'd like to better understand what the X's are and really manage those particular aspects of the process. You got any other thoughts on this, Rick?
Yeah, I mean, you may not like math equations like a lot of us, but what we're really trying to show here is to really get to the bottom of a business process management deployment. You have to get a process view of your business. And what's a process but a sequence of actions that lead to a goal or an end, which we're calling the why. What you do is you look at the why, or the output, as Forrest said, to look at the overall performance. But if you understand the inputs to that performance, in the end you end up managing to the inputs, not the output. That's one of the powers of business process management and why a lot of people go for it. You get down to really understanding the process. So this is to help you with that process view when you're putting your metrics together. Well, I guess I said the next slide, didn't I?
Yeah, that's right. But, and again, we want to get to the point in BPM so we're managing our overall processes at the local level, but we'd also like to look at things strategically and figure out in the end which particular processes need to get improved that's going to help the big picture. You know, so that's what we think is very important, and we call that, that's called enterprise process management, and that's what we're suggesting. Also, that needs to be or should be integrated in the BPM deployment.
Now we're going to move on to the third one, providing a performance metric-driven decision-making. And you've spent all this effort to automate. you should also put in a system to use the information that comes out of BPM. What we get to is there's really, we'll say, two ways decisions can be made in an organization: metric-driven or intuition-driven. In other words, the leadership just has a feeling for what's right. Now, really, every decision should be a mix of both of them. The adoption of BPM, if done well, drives you to more metrics or metric-driven decisions in your business process. Now, I would ask, which do you think is more apt to be right? I think we'd lean on the metric-based ones because they have data behind them. Now, intuition ones may also be good, but as Forrest always tells me when I get in the middle of this stuff, you can't ignore intuition. It really is the balance of the two of them that leads to the greatest success, because not everything has data.
And Rick, also, I think is on that particular point, well, we'd like to get this data-driven piece of it also into the strategic decision-making, you know, as far as actually building the strategies that organizations are incorporating. And we like to integrate that data in part of that, the overall decision-making, and get away from intuition as much as we possibly can and integrate them when it's most appropriate.
Of course. Now, like I said, having data is better, but it's not always there. In a BPM world, you want to have your data when you can. You'd like it right now, and that's good. But if you don't have it, you'll get by. You should design your business process management processes for data collection in mind at the beginning. It is difficult in many of the software systems to actually add data collection points after you've created the process because of the involvement in their database and their warehouse behind it. So being very thoughtful of your performance metrics as you put a process in place can be very beneficial. Even if you don't have data now, start collecting it and set it up to be collected. Now, getting data is fine, but this section is really about the decisions from data. How do you put together the system to make the decisions? Now, in BPM, they call it your business rules and your management rules. What's interesting, everybody says we don't need to spend time on those, but surprisingly, that is one of those other key points that we're spending a lot of time putting together. These are the pieces of a BPM deployment that make sure everybody makes common decisions the same way. So again, when you put them together, you get predictable performance. You actually don't have to micromanage. You can delegate more to your different organizations because if they follow the rules, they will get the right answer. Now, you should always test these rules without automation, but the goal is that you will, I'm struggling here for a minute, but the difficulty is most people don't want to delegate these rules. In many places, well, right now they tell me I can't hear me. Can people hear me? Please text in. I apologize. It looks like there's audio problems at some point. But I'll start again on this one. Yeah, database decisions are good. If you get these involved, you can get predictable performance. People can delegate. The difficulty of many of this is setting the rules is there's a lot of us in management, including me at times, that have been rewarded for being heroes, for correcting stuff out of the business process rules. You really have to work on reducing that as time goes on. So again, put your rules in place, test them with people before you program them, and you'll get a better process. What it means, again, when there's no metric data, use it. When the data doesn't match intuition, that's an interesting point. So having data, having intuition is the right way to go because that's a difference that indicates something isn't right. You may have a metric that's not telling what you want. Your intuition may be off, but those are learning points that help you develop better process management. So a quick review of what we've got so far. You value chain to understand the major functions that you needed in the business. You've identified the key performance metrics that measure performance of your organization. And you've learned and built a system to use those measurements to make informed decisions. So that's 3. There's 2 left to go. Do you have anything, Forrest?
Oh, I think that's a really good starting point. You know, right now what we're doing is building the foundation, a lot of the books that we've seen, that they get to be fragmented, but I think it's really important to have a process for putting all this together with a good foundation. And I think these points that we just listed here are something that everybody needs to keep in mind when they're starting their BPM journey.
Thank you. Fourth one, removing constraints. We talked a little bit about this in our first webinar about the risks. But this is important enough, and we think that it's a key concept that is somewhat left out of the BPM world, the idea of constraint management. We start with the belief in a process-oriented world. The constraints are what hold up performance. Constraints, bottlenecks, things that hold you back. So that's why we worry about them. The theory of constraints talks about a constraint is a restriction to your performance. If you can identify those constraints, those locations or areas or processes, when fixed, will give you the greatest gain. It gets back to, you don't just automate or do BPM where it's easy. You should try to find a way to target it where you get the greatest benefit. And that's what we're leading to. Find that constraint, remove it. You may remove it with the BPM effort, but find it. Now, it sounds simple with me talking. How do you find it? But it may not be as easy in practice as it is in a discussion here. Because many of our constraints are really self-inflicted. All of the quality gurus out there have said exactly the same thing, that we do it to ourselves. Yes, there are constraints in the market, but they are internal too. There's policies. Policies that we've created to limit the way we work. They set up some of our processes. There's ways that are approval. You hear it's always been that way. That defines our organization, which leads to the cultural ones. The nice thing about BPM, Lean Six Sigma, Lean, any of these processes, what you find is that they're able to make your business better because you control everything. And it is difficult to challenge these constraints, but many of them are built into our existing system. Learn to challenge everything. Some examples. There's decisions take too many approvals. I'm sure all of us see that. There's chaotic workflow, both in the movement around the organization, especially after you've had a big growth and you've added a bunch of people in work areas wherever they fit. Some people move to an automation without the staff having the skill to use it. We're just going to do it. The hero one is probably a career that I had for a while. You've rewarded people that don't follow the process because they were able to overcome the barriers you've built into your process. Just the fact that that's happening says you probably need to work on your management piece before you automate. And you can read the other ones. But sometimes rewarding people that are busy, not the ones that are efficient. Even not selling enough or enough of your product or service can be seen as a constraint. You may be very effective within the walls of your organization, but the external market isn't using your service or product enough. Your constraint may be the sales process. They're everywhere. Now, how do you find them?
And I think also that, Rick, that is a lot higher than what we get from some of these other projects. So when we're suggesting you put the BPM system together, it's somewhat of an open kimono of view of everything, and so that now there's nothing really hidden, and we can take on and maybe address some of these tough challenges. It's not saying it's easy, but that may be the most beneficial thing you can do at the current time to an organization.
You are so right, Forrest. The tough part, next step, though, is how do you find them? We gave a couple, 3 clues here. Large work queues, a lot of backed up work, lots of overtime in the transactional or human processes, or looking for tasks that are always late. Now we have a question that came in for us. I'm going to go take it here. One person asked, what are your thoughts on utilizing simulation tools to identify constraints? I really should shake your hand, the person who wrote that, because is that a more creative way or objective way to look at constraints? And to take aside, simulation is a great way to find constraints, especially if your business will be growing, you will increase your transactions or product flow. The constraint may not exist today. We have clients who ask for that, and we'll go find what is their product mix that creates a constraint, or if I improve my sales or throughput up to what I put in my goal for this year, will I be able to do it? Simulations are one of the only ways you can do that offline. Now, we did have, or I guess I had a client earlier in my career that wanted to know what their constraint was, so they would hold back some work over the month, and then one day a month put extra work into their processes to see what their maximum capacities were. And they did this once a month to know what point they would have to expand their capacities. It's another way to do it. But yes, simulation tools are good. We have found that most BPM analysts and practitioners struggle with the concept of writing a simulation. You may want to look to a more analytical resource. They don't have to be a BPM expert. Statisticians, as I am, do it. There's Lean Six Sigma people. It's a small fraction of those can do it. And interestingly enough, there's a lot of simulation work done in the financial fields, especially for looking at investment modeling. Those people can also be a good source of simulation. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, and I would like to elaborate a little bit more on that point also, because when you start changing policies, simulation can be a good way to test out and see whether that policy change is different. And I'll give you an example. This is dealing with the parking lot in the airport, in our hometown airport. They were really listening to the voice of the customer, and they started changing their pickup and drop-off procedures. And what it did was they optimized it a little bit better for people that are returning home, but because of that procedure that they came up with, it negatively impacted the other side of the equation, where people had more delays when they were trying to capture or catch their plane, their departing plane. So they would really listen to the voice of the customer and trying to do what they thought was right, but if they would have done a simulation, they found that their policy change would have really created more problems than it actually solved.
There's many times simulations can save you from that. Thanks for adding that, Forrest. And that leads into what are the implications of unknown constraints? Well, sometimes you only change them as part of a crisis, or maybe that's where they were created. But also you may be doing improvement process work or implement a BPM process in an area that doesn't matter. So maybe finding the constraints important, but making changes in non-constraint processes cost money, they cost time, plus part of your reputation for implementing BPM, and in the end, nothing changed, because that process was not constraining success. This leads us to our fifth step, last one of our five, improve before automate. Seems obvious, right? I think in our first webinar, we had some comments that we were talking a little too much about Lean and Six Sigma. Well, Smarter Solutions does have part of the business that does promote Lean and Six Sigma, training and consulting. But it also means that Forrest and I and the company have a real belief in the benefits of improvement. Any process that hasn't been touched for a year or two probably can take a little enhancement. Now, we'd say it's obvious, but it also is in the body of knowledge, but they call it business process improvement. I mean, you're going to spend so much time in a business process management introduction. You're going to possibly buy software, you train people, you're going to spend a lot of time diagramming the existing processes. If you take the existing process and put it in the software, you've got real coding, you've paid people to create software that does all the management of it. What if there's an improvement? It is a lot more difficult now to change it than if you would have improved it before you actually coded it in the software. It doesn't matter which software. Now, a lot of them talk about they're easy to change, but I'll tell you something. When you build the data collection pieces of it in the data warehouse, that becomes a lot more difficult to add stuff in. So why not, once you diagram it, before you put it in your software, take an investigation of improvement. It may not need one, but you should always look at it. Do you have anything for that, Forrest?
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect of it, because if you got a bad process, you can do it bad things a lot quicker, And so
yes, my
you
joke
really
with
need
some
to keep
people
that
is
in
about
mind.
after process that wastes time and labor. But let's look at it. As part of a BPM deployment, what should you do? You document your business, you document your process rules, diagram each process, set up the metrics. At that moment right now, you could transition into a software and start coding it, but why not pause for a minute? Look at the execution and standardize it. We find that if you standardize it before you put the software in, you get a little less resistance of your people, because now you can talk to them as they're managing from the way they do it today into a more standardized execution. You can remove or maybe formalize rework. If you've got a lot of stuff being done outside of your standard process, you automate it and you took that away, you may see some negative impacts on your customer. Understand where they're running outside of the process. If you want to formalize it, do it. If not, improve the process so you don't need it. Next one, simplify. You may have a lot of steps that are unnecessary because they've always been that way. It could be a fallout from earlier processes. You left it there. It may even been a way to keep everybody busy. I don't know. But you should always step back and say, do I need to do all these steps? Yes, I do them today, but should I simplify my process? And I guess the last one is probably the only one we all think about. If the quality is unacceptable, fix it before you automate it. Hope that's clear. We have another question here. I will interrupt you. It says, in a very dynamic business environment, couldn't the BPM approach place hurdles to the adaptation of a constantly evolving market condition? Is the BPM approach recommended in these environments? And that's an interesting question. We talk to people about it. Business is always changing and dynamic, and probably more every year, just because of information flow and technology is becoming a bigger and bigger part. I would say there's always something changing. But if you look at your business in a process-oriented view, many of the building blocks or processes do not really change that much. And yes, you should consider that in your deployment of your BPM processes. They should really target repetitive processes that have a lot of humans involved with them, or people. Those are the most beneficial ones generally to look at for BPM deployment, because I want to standardize them. Now, yes, in a rapidly changing environment, things change. People don't generally put BPM in their development processes and their new innovation processes. We usually use it on established processes. When you have it in place, what you'll find is you'll be easier to innovate in the other areas because you've standardized the whole business in areas where you could. Do you have something on that one too, Forrest?
Yeah, I sure do. I guess I tend to look at it, you made one statement in there that I might look at it a little differently, because I think you actually need it more when things are changing a lot. And that's when it gets involved in more the enterprise process management piece of it, where you want to have systems that can make your organization receptive to the environment out there so that we become more reactive. And I look at that as a process in itself. And if you don't have those sorts of I believe you need it even more so. And that's where we get into our enterprise process management piece. And we'll give a little plug here. We're going to have, we just got a brand new book on this, and we'll give you a deal at the end of this webinar. But we get into that in this book also.
Thank you, Forrest. I'm going to, before the next slide, we also have an additional question that follows along with this concept. The idea of do what you do before you automate. we have one of the person says, do the BPM suites, I assume meaning the software suites, help you identify constraints or inefficiencies, or are they mostly focused on the execution of a defined process? Now, I think you might get differences on which vendor you talk to, because yes, you can use those to identify constraints, but to do that, you've done it after you've automated the process. Really the best time is to do it ahead of time, whether simulation, which is recommended, but we recommend building the process up, testing what you want to do with your people within the current environment, build the business rules, use your value chain, use your metrics, and when you choose to take it to the suite to automate, use the business process management suite to formalize the new automated process and really to be the carrier of all your information and data collection. Because if you find a constraint after the suite puts it together, you then have to go back to it and modify your existing system. So yes, they can help you. I don't know about inefficiencies, but they can help you find constraints. The inefficient stuff you'll probably more find with observations of the process itself.
Yeah, I tend to, you know, now, like you said, if you talk to a supplier, the BPMN type supplier of the automation, they might have a different response. My take would be is you want to find the constraints beforehand and use that to automate the processes. That would be the approach I would suggest using. You know, they may have another approach, but it seemed like that would be a better way of doing it. And then you're automating things that are really going to streamline the overall process. But I don't think you want to keep tweaking on that any more than you have to, you know.
And Forrest, guess what? We've got another question. We must have hit a topic that people are interested in.
Yeah.
One person asked, what if the only way we can fix quality is to automate it so that we have an accurate data because the manual data doesn't feel correct? That could be true. But back to my improvement side of me, before you automate it, you still have to diagram the process out and understand the steps that will be going into it. When you're actually observing your process or talking to people about how it's done, you are going to find issues where there's reworks, where there's errors, where there's quality issues in the discussion of the people and the observation. The manual data that you have historically may not show it, but in your creation of the process prior to the adoption in the BPM suite, you should have seen all this stuff. So you may not have data on it, but your observation will tell you where the quality issues are happening, where the rework is. I would pause at the moment and dig deeper in those processes before I move it to the automation step. But I'll admit, there'll be times that you won't recognize the quality issues until you automate it, especially if you pick a single standardized path that isn't optimal. So with the best of effort, I'm sure you will still miss some.
Yeah, I would ask the question also. I'm not sure I understand the question. If I understand the question, is that if manual entry of data into spreadsheets or writing it down on a tablet or whatever and entering it, it's obviously got some challenges for its data integrity. People can write the wrong time or something else could be having issues with it. But the question I ask is there a way of actually collecting that data so it's not so manual, you know, or at least takes a little manual piece out of it? And because I would hate to really go in and do automation, so that's the reason I got the data. You know, I would like to go in and see if there's another way of automatically collecting the data and being able to report that out, especially like I like the 30,000-foot level if you can at all, and then try to figure out, use automation to actually make the metrics better, you know, as opposed to the reason for collecting the data.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, when I saw that question for us, it made me think that really is what the BPM body of knowledge talks about in business process improvement. If you really have an inadequate process and you take that to automation, you won't fix quality. All you'll do is make your process produce that quality with a little less labor potentially, or more consistently. But really, if you think you have a quality issue and you don't think any of the data supports the resolution of it, I recommend stepping back to the business process improvement tools, whether that's a Lean, a Kaizen, a Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, or Lean and Six Sigma. But if you really think you have a quality issue, I would pause and run through a cycle of improvement prior to taking it to automation. Since we are really at the end of our material, I'm going to keep answering this questions for us, but we have another one. Would you include the steps to validate the measurement process in the setup of the metrics step? You want to take that one for us?
Yeah. Well, I think the thing is, first off, I like to look at it, and I'm assuming that somebody's leading to gauge R&R type issue. You know, in other words, if I have a particular thing that I'm trying to measure and somebody else looked at it, would they get the same answer if I looked at it again? Now, to me, that's, you know, sometimes you're going to have some of that. You're going to have variabilities for a given situation. You get a different number. So I like to look at it at a 30,000-foot level is, hey, this is what I have. This is what the measurement is. Now, if the measurement is okay, then I wouldn't worry about it. Okay, if we believe it's given us in general the right answer, you know, I mean that's another issue. If he's giving the wrong answer, that's another issue. But so that's what I would tend to do it. Now, if we've got a response that doesn't give us what we want, you know, one of the first things that you want to look at is really, is my measurement system part of the problem? And a lot of times people don't start with that way, and that's an important aspect. Even like when you go to the doctor's office and they go in and take your blood pressure, you know, and then if they did it again, would they get the same answer? You know, maybe not. But if you're dependent upon what it was before, they may be treating you because of that. So that measurement system is really part of the overall response that you need to be consciously aware of it. But it kind of depends upon the particular situation, because that can be a lot of work to actually start looking in and start changing your measurement system, especially when you're looking at a lot of numbers. You know, you just need to be careful, and more often than not, put some common sense with it along with that, making that decision whether you want to get into doing a measurement system analysis or not.
Well, thank you. That was what they were asking for us. But I'm going to add one that wasn't asked for in that. Just in the idea of metrics and measuring process performance, you may make a best effort at selecting the correct performance metrics, but everybody who does that should be looking for every month or so, for even up to a year, to ensure that that metric is really showing them what they think it is. Even in best efforts, I've put a great metric together that didn't recognize when the process changed because it wasn't quite right. It didn't capture everything I needed. So every time you put a metric together, you should always look at the validity of it, both in what Forrest talked about, is it giving me the right value, but there's also the validity, is it measuring the right characteristic of your process too. So that is important.
And I think the other thing is a footnote relative to this, since I've seen it happen so frequently. A lot of times people will start looking at the numbers for last quarter, and they'll start looking at quarter by quarter. And what I'm suggesting, that's not a good way of doing it. You really want to look at the overall process. You know, magically on December 31st to January 1st, things don't change. But often we look at things annually. And when we in BPM, it's important to actually look at it as a process. We're understanding that typically from December 31st to January 1st are other particular events during the year, for example, quarters. Things don't magically change, and we want to look at it as an overall process. And if a process is consistent for 3 years, it's consistent for 3 years, and then we make a decision off of that too.
Hey, Forrest, we took another question that specifically would like you to answer it.
Okay.
It was asked, would you comment on implementing Sarbanes-Oxley through BPM with a statement that Sarbanes-Oxley has an information technology and a financial accounting side, which makes a complete implementation through BPM. Now, I know you have thoughts on Sarbanes-Oxley.
Right. And in fact, a number of years ago when Sarbanes-Oxley came out, you know, I started looking at what they were talking about within the various sections of the article, and they talk about processes and so on, and I'm saying, hey, there's a perfect fit for this. but it didn't seem like I could get anybody else's attention to this, because I think the spirit of the Sarbanes-Oxley, that this BPM and also how we're looking at metrics is very aligned to this. But in reality, the people that are doing Sarbanes-Oxley type folks are not typically the process type people. You know, they're maybe more the accountants and things like that, or and a lot of times they don't look at it that way. But I think it would be an excellent way of actually really addressing the spirit of what Sarbanes-Oxley is all about.
Thank you, Forrest. Hey, we're getting close. We got about 10 minutes left if we have time. There's not another outstanding question right now, so I think it's time we're going to start our wrap-up. But please continue to ask questions. If you enter questions after the end, if we didn't catch them, we will contact you later with answers. So feel free. And also, those emails that we put at the beginning or the one at the end, you can still email us questions if you have them. Let's go back to our 5 steps. Create a value chain. Know what you do at a high level so you can link or connect your business process management efforts into the true important functions of your organization. When I know what I do, identify key performance metrics. Those are the ones that you will use to make business decisions on process execution and on where you might want to automate first. Build the performance metric-driven data decision-making process. This is the part that we also, like we said, we feel people underutilize or don't spend the time on in a BPM deployment. It's creating the business rules. Most of the software suites are really strong about getting you to put together the process business rules because they're used in the logic of diagramming and executing your process. But we're saying take that concept, step back from the process, and use the same concept to build business rules at the management level that manages your processes, the same as we would for BPM, to use the data that comes out of your BPM process to make the right business decisions, not process. Again, as Forrest said, the enterprise process management piece, that's what we want you to build on.
Yeah, and Rick, I think I just keep on underlining this, and because that's like one of my big soapboxes, is to how you present the data. How do you look at data so that you can go in and make those decisions that are the right thing to do? Because if you start looking at just like red, yellow, green scorecards, I'm at this summit here, and I saw these red, yellow, green scorecards that these executives were embracing. And the thing is, I think it just leads to the wrong kind of behavior. So it's more than just performance metrics making that statement, but how you look at the data and look at it as a process. You know, red, yellow, green scorecards don't. You know, and what we want to do is have a system for looking at this metric that's going to lead to the right kind of decisions. And also the constraints that Rick's going to be leading to on our 4th item here.
Yeah, the next one's removing constraints. And again, we think you find those by looking at your processes as part of your preparation for automation, but also when you start with the value chain and look at your key processes and metrics, despite or without putting a BPM, most of this all could be done. But again, remove constraints, target them with BPM if they're at the process level so that you get the biggest change within your organization. And the last one is improve before automation. Now, we really thank you for all the questions that came up because they really emphasized a lot of the stuff out there. The idea of improving early, automating a process that's not right, how to automate in an environment that's variable, which they all are, but all these 5 together can really make your business process management system work better. And what's hard for me to even talk to clients at some level is you can actually implement BPM and get much of the gain without a software suite. Because really the concepts in there, if you remove automation, are just good business principles that many of our organizations that have grown a lot, or even if they have many remote sites like a financial group, like a bank, it's this idea of business rules, finding constraints, data-driven decisions. That's the right way to do business, even if you choose not to automate. And Forrest and I talk a lot about actually dry running these automated processes without software. and work on that optimization. It really does work. So Forrest is going to wrap up here with why should you care about what we're talking about here?
You know, I think the thing is, we like the first bullet there talks about, we start out these big initiatives with big fanfare, you know, but in reality, a lot of times, whether it's Lean Six Sigma or TQM or Lean or whatever we're talking about, a lot of times it really doesn't positively impact the big picture, and it dies off. You know, we don't have the people throughout the organization looking at this as a collective system. You know, like right now I'm attending a summit here, a manufacturing summit, but it still applies to basically everything, is you have these presentations are talking about Kaizen events and things that they've gone in and tried to improve certain aspects of the overall system. But in reality, a lot of these efforts are silos, and they didn't really positively impact the overall system putting it together. And whenever you take this BPM and integrate it with enterprise process management, you've got a powerful piece where now everybody's starting to looking at all the data of the value chain. That's all available and clickable. So now you can get process metrics readily available anytime you want, any part of the world. And it can lead to a completely different kind of behavior. I was working with a mining company down in South America, and whenever you saw people going through at the management level, clicking through the value chain in real time, that they could do this, and then it changes the behaviors, and they start looking at these bottlenecks that we're talking about. And now you're going to be doing these process improvement efforts that affect the big picture. I just believe this is a way that people ought to be going in and looking at things. And these 5 simple steps that we talked about here can be the starting point to get you going in that sort of direction. So again, just starting with automation alone, we don't believe that's the way you ought to do it. You need to start focusing on the big picture and then determine where you should be focusing your automation efforts so that now you can really get the most benefit possible from the automation efforts. You know, if we start looking at what Eli Goldrack talked about in the goal, I mean, that was what the book was all about, identifying the overall constraint. And that's where you ought to focus your efforts. And that's what's going to help the big picture the most. And when you blend this enterprise process management with it, you can actually do that. And I think we're taking it to the next step beyond the goal, where we're looking at metrics and putting it together with this value chain on how you're doing processes throughout the organization. And it's just the way to go. And so I've talked to you know, quite a few executives here one-on-one, and you know, whenever I was showing this to them, they were really getting excited, and so I gave them a copy of the books, and then they could go in and start seeing how this kind of all fits together. And that's what I'd like to do. We're going to give you an offer here. Is that the next slide, Rick?
Yes, it is, Forrest. I will go there.
Okay, so what you can do is download a free ebook that we have on this enterprise process management. And so this one just came out, you know, just as in a couple weeks here. And also we've got value for the hard copy. So you can get a hard copy of that also, and you're going to be getting the first ones off the presses here. And so we got a deal for that. You can get a discount on that by going in and using the discount code that we have listed on that slide. So I really hope that you take advantage of this, because this is not just a high-level book, but it kind of gets into all the nuts and bolts and basically puts it all together. And so we spend a lot of time, and it makes some references to other books. And so the book is about like 150 pages long or so, but it makes references to some of the other books they have if you really need to get into the more mathematical aspects of putting it all together. So hopefully you'll go ahead and take us up on these offers, and we'd like to get your feedback on what you think about them.
Yeah, and Forrest, to reiterate, the book is not just about what this webinar was about. It's really about the whole setting up of a business process management system. So it really is not just this webinar. It was a full book that's got enough information to really help you through this. And again, it's free in both a Kindle format, an EPUB format, which works on most readers, and there's also a PDF copy if that's more preferred on your PC. They're free to download. All you owe us is your email address for it. So thank you for everything. Again, we'll wrap this up. Reduce risk, be successful. There's a lot involved with the business process management implementation, a lot of reputation, a lot of money, and a lot of time. If your effort can keep it from just being an IT effort, you will benefit your company, and that really is our goal. We want people to do well. We want businesses to do well. If you want more information, there's our phone number in the United States, 512-918-0280. You can contact us at either forrest@smartersolutions.com, rick.h@smartersolutions.com, or with the slideshows, just info@smartersolutions.com, that which might be easier. You can see our hours at +6 GMT, and just ask for us. We'd be glad to talk with you. I can see also a couple have already emailed us for copies of the presentations. Please do. We want to share it. Even if you don't choose to do business with us, we'd like you to get better. We will have one more webinar sponsored by the Process Excellence Network coming up, and I believe Forrest is putting out another white paper on this subject of management coming up in the next couple weeks. Please keep an eye on it when you're looking at your Process Excellence Network newsletters, or contact us if you want a copy early on it. We can let you know when stuff's happening. So thank you, everybody. Do you have anything to add, Forrest, to wrap it up?
No, I appreciate everybody tuning in here. And again, just want to underscore what Rick talked about here. We're more than happy to discuss any of the challenges that you might have or thoughts that you might have on implementing BPM or any related topic.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Forrest, and of course, thanks to everyone that's attended the webinar today. So I think we'll leave it there, Rick and Forrest. That's all for this webinar. But for our audience, don't forget that for additional white papers, podcasts, webinars, and much more, log on to www.pexnetwork.com.
The organ